interesting that I was at Michigan State for 5 years doing my PhD, and during that time, I had one interaction with the IACUC, and that was when I was submitting my grant. I had a grant during that time, and again, I was doing in vitro work, but they decided that I needed an IACUC protocol for some aspect of what I was doing, and it was at that time, I remember, about 1 page I think I had to fill out, and I never saw it again for 5 years. So I don't know how that worked, but that was the way it worked at that time. When I went to Western, again, I did have to go through the IACUC for some aspects of my work. I used um, bovine serum albumin in my cell culture, so I had to have some sort of review of that, and I had to have some review to go out and collect the arteries. So I had an interaction with them, but again, it was a very abbreviated process, and I think that there would be inspections and there would be things like that, but it all was very background, nothing that was disruptive to my work. And I realized I was not doing a lot of whole animal work, so I wasn't the focus of them. But it's interesting how little I had to do with the IACUC when I was at Western, other than occasionally in an advisory capacity or maybe helping out with an inspection. Or we were actually building a new science building at the time, and there was a lot of discussion about what that facility should look like in terms of animal housing. But when I got my started working on the IACUC at Pharmacy and Upjohn, that was my first real exposure to a whole process and program review and inspections and protocol review, and at that time entirely a paper process, tons of paper. I would get these stacks of protocols to review, and they were all written. Every detail was. I almost think some of that was handwritten too. It makes me sound like a dinosaur, but I think that it was a while ago. The process at the time was extremely veterinary driven. The veterinary group, in fact, I remember when I was considering taking the job, I talked to a friend of mine who was a scientist. He was a graduate student I knew that had gone to work for a research company, and I told him I was thinking about taking this IACUC position. He said, "Oh my gosh, don't do that. You'll be a pariah. No one will like you. Everyone, the guy at our facility is in the basement. No one likes him." And I said, "Oh, sounds delightful." But it was very typical at that time that the IACUC and a veterinarian of some sort were synonymous. And I think what was just beginning to happen when I got into the field was that it was not just veterinarians anymore. There were the first few people that I met in the field that were actually what I would consider to be IACUC professionals. They were few and far between. I could count on one hand the number of people I knew who were not. I'm not talking about maybe an administrator working just to keep the paperwork for the IACUC, but either a scientist or a veterinarian or someone who was working not as a lab animal vet, but working for the IACUC specifically. It was just a very early days in the separation. I think originally people saw that as, the animal welfare is the veterinarian's job and not as the scientist's job. And it created this separation, which was extremely stressful. I think when I started working in that role, I think the first thing I had to do was overcome the thought that I was the police and I was going to be coming in and passing judgment, and we were going to be having all these acrimonious interactions, and it was going to be a really ugly constant battle for them wanting to get their rights as scientists and me telling them what they couldn't do. And so my perspective right away was that we need to work together on this. And that's community. I think that's important to you. It's important to me. Was how can we manage to do this in a collegial way, because we all want the same thing. We want the research to go forward in a compliant way. Yeah, I think that at the time the people were either very driven to get protocols approved, and their focus was primarily on, let's not get in the way. Let's just get this done and let them move on and do what they have to do. And then there was the other half who felt like every single step that researchers took was, kind of a defiant move that was thwarting their purpose as veterinarians. There was a lot of separation, and there were veterinarians on both sides of that. I mean, there were people who saw themselves aligned primarily with getting research done, and there were people who were aligned very much with let's just do everything the very best way possible. And I don't know that either one was particularly productive because there was no it was difficult to get the cooperation that you need from the scientists when they felt like they were always being antagonized versus clearly we didn't want to be a rubber stamp organization. What I have to say is that the people who serve on IACUCs, and I found this throughout my career, no matter how they came into it, almost universally became advocates once they had done it. We used to use service on the IACUC as sort of a punishment at some points in our process. When someone would have a compliance issue, you need to serve on the IACUC, and we would bring them in and do that. I think that doing that usually was extremely effective because they would appreciate what went into the deliberations and how important it was to consider things from both sides. And they would become great advocates because were mostly scientists who would go back to the other scientists and be spokespersons and explain why is this important, why do we do things the way we do it.